Soft winter wind, distant creaking trees, faint chimes carried by the cold. Winter remembers. Long after the fires burn down to embers, long after the footprints in the snow have vanished beneath fresh drifts, long after the living retreat indoors to escape the bitter dark, winter continues to remember the ones who didn't make it home, the ones who took the wrong path, the ones who wandered too far, the ones who were claimed by the cold. Across the northern world, across centuries, cultures, and landscapes shaped by ice and silence, stories whisper of children seen where no footprints should be, small figures standing at the tree line, shadows that look back, names called from the dark by voices too soft, too young to belong to anything living. On this episode, we will walk into that winter. I am Gregory Hallows, and this is Preserve Halloween Podcast. On this episode, this podcast, it might not be tonight, I don't know when you're listening, we will enter the oldest and coldest corner of winter folklore, a place where ghost stories drift like snow, where forgotten spirits wander between storms, and where the boundary between life and death grows quiet, thin, and terribly gentle. These are the children of the snow, lost spirits, frozen memories, the winter's youngest shadows. This episode will take you across Scandinavian legends, alpine hauntings, rural American ghost tales, Inuit warnings whispered into the icy wind, and the strange Victorian obsession with children as symbols of innocence and death intertwined. We will meet not only ghosts, but creatures, winter beings who protect, lure, guide, or punish. And along the way, we will hear their stories. Because winter is haunted, not by malice, but by memory, not by rage, but by longing. And no spirit longs more deeply than a child left behind. So let's begin. The oldest winter ghost stories were not carved into books or written into songs. They were breathed into cold air by survivors. When warmth was scarce, when nights lasted 14 hours or more, the world felt wider and emptier. The dark pressed in like a living thing. Families huddled together in firelit rooms, and the wind howled outside like something searching. People said that children who died in winter did not rest easily. It wasn't cruel, it was simply the way the world worked. A child lost to frost or hunger was considered unfinished, still tethered to the people who loved them, still wandering in the places they last walked. And so the earliest ghost stories were not horror tales. They were explanations, expressions of grief, attempts to make sense of what the cold had taken. One of the earliest recorded stories of a winter child spirit comes from northern Sweden, near the forests of Jämtland. It goes something like this. A woodcutter returning home at dusk saw a young girl standing alone beside the frozen path. She wore no coat, and her hair was crusted with ice. When he approached, she lifted her hand as if asking for help. He dropped his lantern in shock, for where her feet should have pressed into the snow, the ground remained untouched, smooth, unbroken. The girl faded like breath in cold air. The woodcutter fled, leaving his lantern behind. When he returned at sunrise, he found the lantern still burning, the snow perfectly still, and beside it, the faint impression of a child's hand pressed into the ice. Stories like this were not simply meant to frighten. They were reminders that in winter you do not travel alone. You do not stray from the path. You do not ignore the voices carried by the wind, because the wind remembers too. Across the world, winter is a season of hunger and quiet tragedy. In the far north of Canada and Greenland, Inuit stories speak of Kalapuliat, creatures who live beneath the sea ice and snatch wandering children who stray too close to the cracks. Their purpose is not monstrous. They are caution embodied. Spirits born from the need to keep children safe from real danger. Some say a Kalapulak appears as a pale woman wrapped in eider feathers. Others say she is dark and shadowed, her skin is cracked as the ice she lives beneath. But everyone agrees on one thing. If a child is taken, their voice will echo beneath the ice long after. These are not ghosts, but they serve the same role. Guardians made from fear. In Siberia, the Chukchi told stories of Arnaquaskak, the snow mother, who gathers the souls of frozen children and carries them through winter storms so they do not wander alone. Travelers claim that during blizzards they could hear faint laughter, tiny footsteps pacing across the drifts, the brush of small fingers against the tent walls. If you heard these sounds, it meant the children of the snow mother were passing by, harmless unless you stepped outside to follow them. Because that is the danger of winter spirits. When they appear, they often appear as something familiar, something innocent, and something in need. And human beings, especially in lonely places, are drawn to voices that call out softly in the dark. The Victorian era understood this intimately. Long before Dickens transformed Christmas into a season of sentimental redemption, the holiday belonged to ghost stories. And many of those stories involve children, lost children, wicked children, children who returned to deliver warnings, children who froze to death after wandering away from the hearth, children who visited their parents in dreams, urging them to change their ways. In 1861, the London newspaper The Strand published a ghost anecdote told by a nursemaid in Kent. She described waking one night to the sound of a child sobbing outside the window. When she looked out, she saw a boy no older than 5, barefoot in the snow, crying softly. As she leaned forward to call for help, the boy looked up, and she recognized him. He had died the previous winter of scarlet fever. She fainted immediately. In the morning, the only trace of the visitor was a small set of footprints that led to nowhere. And as we discussed in the last podcast, Victorians loved these stories, and not because they delighted in suffering, but because childhood and death were dangerously close companions in their world. A ghost child was not an anomaly, it was an inevitability. Across Norway and Finland, a different figure roamed the winter nights, the Hisk, ghost children who froze to death after losing their way. They were said to be gentle, almost playful. They knocked on windows during storms. They laughed faintly in the woods. They followed travelers at a distance, appearing as small flickers of white in the corner of the eye. But if you turned to look at them directly, they vanished into the falling snow. So here's another tale, short tale. This one is from Norway, and it was recorded in the early 1900s. A farmer walking home heard what he thought was a child running behind him. Light steps crunching in the snow. He stopped. The steps stopped. He walked faster. The steps resumed. When he turned, he saw a small figure standing in the path, but its face was pale and without eyes, just smooth frost where features should have been. The farmer fled, and the child spirit watched him go. Its head tilted slightly, like a lost creature wondering why no one would help it. There's something deeply primal about winter ghosts. Unlike vengeful spirits or spectral apparitions tied to violence, winter ghosts represent a different kind of haunting, longing, incompleteness, the echo of life interrupted. These are not monsters. These are memories with nowhere left to go. In Japanese folklore, winter is home to the Yukiwarashi, the snow child, who appears during whiteout storms. Sometimes they are playful, leaving small snowballs by doorsteps. Other times they appear at the foot of beds, bringing dreams of cold landscapes. A few stories warn that if you follow a Yukiwarashi outside, you will never return. But most tales describe them as gentle, lonely spirits who simply want warmth. And that is the thread connecting all of these winter child spirits: loneliness. Winter isolates you, winter silences. Winter creates a space where the boundary between the living and the dead feels fragile and almost negotiable. In some parts of Eastern Europe, people believe that children lost in winter would return for one final night each year, not to haunt, but to visit. Families left candles in windows. They placed small mittens by the door. They sprinkled flour on the floor to see if little footprints appeared. One woman in rural Poland claimed that her daughter, who died at the age of 7 from pneumonia, visited her every Christmas Eve. She described a small warm shape settling beside her in bed, as if curling close for comfort. Whether this was a ghost or grief reshaping itself into something bearable, it didn't matter. Unfortunately, winter spirits are not always gentle. In the mountains of Romania, a creature known as the Abelkopel, the Pale Child, appears to travelers lost in snowstorms. It walks ahead of them, leading them through forests and ravines, always just a few steps out of reach. Some say it is trying to guide them home. Others insist it is leading them into danger. The truth, like the child itself, shifts in the blowing snow. Here's another short anecdote or story from that region. A shepherd searching for a lost lamb claimed to see a young girl standing at the edge of a cliff. She turned to him and smiled, a strangely calm smile, given the storm raging around them. She beckoned him forward. As he stepped closer, a gust of wind blew her cloak aside, revealing no feet beneath, only drifting snow. Terrified, he stumbled back. The girl faded like mist. The next morning, searchers found footprints, the shepherd's, leading dangerously close to the cliff's edge. Winter spirits, whether kind or cruel, exist in liminal landscapes. Forests where the snow muffles sound, frozen lakes that mirror the moonlight, villages where chimneys smoke endlessly because warmth is survival. And what makes the children of the snow so compelling is not their danger, but their humanity. They evoke something deep, our instinct to protect the young, our fear of losing them, our own childhood vulnerabilities resurfacing in the cold. They are mirrors, they are warnings, they are echoes. But most of all, they are reminders. Winter takes, winter remembers, and winter in its quiet way keeps what it claims. So, we're going to journey into how these lost spirits will shape Christmas traditions, winter festivals, regional folklore across the world, and how these stories still survive today. We're getting, settling into winter right now. Of course, not the first winter. The one that arrives like a curious visitor, dusting rooftops and sending children into gleeful play. No, we're in second winter. The heavy winter, the winter that does not ask permission. It will press its white weight against every doorway, seeping through cracks in old wood, and hushes the world the way a parent hushes a frightened child. Except winter's hush does not comfort, it warns. And as we continue with this podcast and our journey through the children of the snow, the world outside is growing darker. And not because the sun has vanished, but because the stories are shifting. We've discussed the shape of this folklore so far, but now we're going to step inside of it. Across the northern world, families once spoke of the winter road, a path visible only in the coldest months, lit faintly by moonlight on ice. It was said to be walked by wandering ancestors, ghostly children who died in the cold, spirits searching for warmth they no longer felt, and sometimes something far older than humans. The winter road always led somewhere unfamiliar, into forests that no one remembered planting, toward houses that stood where no house had ever been, or sometimes simply to a blank, horizonless white. In Finnish folklore, children who died in the snow were called lumilapset, snow children. They were believed to walk the winter road in small groups, afraid to travel alone. One story tells of a hunter who, upon turning a corner, found a trail of tiny footprints leading into the woods, even though no living child had left the village in weeks. I like how they say the no living child. The footprints did not show toes or heels, just smooth impressions, as though the feet had no bones. He followed them only a few steps, and then he turned back. He never said what he heard deeper in the trees, only that it sounded like children singing, but not in any language he knew. So here's another story. This one's called The Girl in the Shawl. An old woman from rural Wales told a story that she insisted was true into her final days. One winter, she was walking home from a neighbor's house when she saw a small figure standing beside a broken stone wall, a girl in a thin shawl, far too light for the cold. The woman asked, "Where is your mother, child?" The girl simply pointed down the road. But when the woman looked, the path was empty. When she turned back, the girl was gone, and only the shawl remained, fluttering lightly in the wind. The woman picked it up, and it was warm, warmer than hands could ever make it, and she kept this shawl until the day she died. Her granddaughter later said that the shawl was always cold when anyone else touched it. So, that's nuts. We're going to go back to the Victorian era. This was the height of ghost story tradition. They loved hauntings, especially in winter. They saw it as a season of stillness, the season of memory, season when the veil did not lift but just settled in. Victorians believed ghost children appeared more readily because children felt the cold most sharply. Winter was historically the deadliest season for the young. Children belonged to liminal spaces, not fully worldly and not fully spiritually. They were drifting in between. Victorian sentimentality made child spirits potent symbols. They were a blend of innocence, tragedy, and moral teaching. And ghost children symbolized the fragility of life, the cruelty of winter, the dangers of poverty, the unresolved weight of a short, unfinished existence, and their stories were warnings wrapped in sorrow. Victorian families often described a peculiar winter ritual, and this is something that's, nearly vanished. When frost would form on the window glass, children were told to do not touch the ice. Those are the fingers of lost children. Just let them draw. Parents said the patterns were messages from the ghosts of children frozen in blizzards, trying to trace their way back home. Some patterns look like feathers, others look like spidery lines branching endlessly. Some truly did resemble tiny hands. And in 1889, a London reporter wrote, "My daughter awoke me shrieking, claiming a child's face has pressed against the frozen window. I only saw ice, but the shape of the frost resembled a mouth open as though calling." The story became so widespread that families began covering bedroom windows with thick drapes to keep the frost children from appearing. So here's another story. This one's called The Three by the Well. On the Isle of Skye, a midwife returning home late claimed she saw 3 children standing beside an old stone well, barefoot, pale, wearing clothes decades out of fashion. She asked if they needed help. The youngest stepped forward and said, "Do you have a candle? We are so cold." The midwife held out her lantern, and when the child reached for it, their hand passed straight through the flame, and the lantern did not flicker. So that's one of those short, you just saw a ghost stories. In Central Europe, folklore speaks of the Schneekender, a pale figure seen drifting near frozen lakes just after a storm. They don't walk, they don't float, they're kind of doing something in between. And in these stories, the snow children were not malicious, they are just terribly lonely. Villagers believed if a snow child followed you home, it was because it wanted warmth, and it would linger by your door for days because they could not cross the threshold. It's like a vampire almost. Parents left candles outside during blizzards as offerings to keep them away from the windows. In some alpine regions, storytellers spoke of the Pale Choir, a group of ghost children that would sing warnings about avalanches or approaching storm. And people listened because sometimes the storms came, and sometimes the songs were heard again the next year. Here's another story. This one's called The Boy Who Held the Lantern. In 1912, a Scottish farmer claimed to see a small boy standing near the gate during a blizzard, clutching a lantern that burned blue. The farmer opened the door and shouted for the boy to come inside. The boy simply turned and walked toward the field. The farmer followed him only to find no footprints in the snow. The lantern flame, however, lingered in the air for several long seconds before it dimmed and vanished. Some said the lantern marked the place where the farmer's own brother had died 50 years earlier. Others said winter simply remembers. So, the world that we're discovering in this podcast just keeps getting colder, right? But these ghost children do not appear as villains, but they're echoes. They're remnants of a life interrupted, shadows of warmth extinguished too soon. These children remind us that storms come too fast, the doors open too late, candles left burning were too small, the harshness of winter showed no mercy. But they also remind us that memory itself is kind of a lantern. It's something that glows even in the deepest dark. Winter forgets nothing, and the snow remembers every footprint, even the ones that never pressed on the ground. Oh, spooky town. Winter nights grow long, not just in hours, but in memory. And as we keep going deeper into this podcast, we're now going to enter the part of the winter folklore where the stories begin to echo one another, where grief, caution, love, and fear blend so completely that you can't tell which part belongs to the living and which to the dead. Because when it comes to ghost children, snow children, almost every culture on earth has a tale that sounds strangely familiar. There was a child that wandered too far. There was a storm that came too quickly. There was a light that was mistaken for safety. And the winter will take what the world is not ready to lose. But here's the caveat. Winter takes nothing without leaving a story behind. So we're going to follow that trail of stories, right? And there's a lot of good ones. In much of Northern Europe, winter was described not as a season, but as a presence. Not a thing that arrived, but something that descended. Something that watched from the tree line and breathed across fields and lakes. Elders in remote villages used to say that winter itself carried off the careless, and on certain nights you could hear the footsteps of those who didn't make it home. Those childish footsteps repeating, not approaching, not receding, just echoing across the snow. A reminder, a warning, a prayer, and maybe a haunting. So here's a story. The footsteps behind the barn. It was said that in a cluster of farms near the Bavarian border, families heard footsteps behind the barn every year on the same night. A single set of small steps crunching through the untouched snow. Yet when lanterns were lit and taken outside, there were no tracks at all. Parents called it the little walker, a spirit child who froze on his way home generations earlier. He didn't knock on doors. He didn't cry or call out. He simply walked and walked and walked. And they said as long as he walked, no other child in the village would be lost to the winter. He was a haunting turned guardian. Across Scandinavian and Baltic regions, there was a belief that lost children didn't become malicious spirits. They became winter companions. They drifted along the edges of traveling families, unseen but felt, offering silent warnings. When the ice was too thin, when the snow would conceal a ditch, when the cold would kill you faster than expected. Many believe that if you survived a winter night that should have taken you, you have been helped by a snow child, a spirit whose own journey never completed. And this belief wasn't creepy to them, it was comforting. In worlds shaped by fierce winters, you learned quickly that the dead weren't something to fear. They were something you lived beside. So here's another story. I told you there was a bunch. The Girl with the Lantern. In an old Estonian tale, a farming couple once saw a faint lantern glow moving across their field during a snowstorm. Thinking it was their daughter returning home early, they rushed outside only to find the field empty. But the lantern glow remained, hovering low, drifting toward the road. They followed it, and halfway down the path, they found their daughter collapsed in the snow, barely conscious. She had gotten lost after leaving school. When she awoke, she asked, "Who was walking with you? I saw the lantern from far away." But the parents had brought no lantern of their own. Locals claimed they knew the answer. A child who never made it home had guided one who still could. Was it a ghost story? Yes. Was it a winter miracle? Maybe. Was it a shared truth? Absolutely. Because winter as a storyteller rarely wastes symbolism. And many cultures believed in the wild hunt, those raucous, ruckus, crazy, terrifying hosts of winter spirits. Not made solely of warriors and witches, they had children among them. Lost children, frozen children, children who wandered into storms and never found the path out. In some German regions, mists swirling across fields at dusk were thought to contain their faint outlines. Shepherds told of hearing small voices when snow began to fall, as if the air itself whispered warnings. This wasn't meant to frighten children, at least not entirely. It was a kind of mythological safety net, a way of reminding villagers, never leave after dark without a lantern, never cross a field during first snow, and never assume silence means safety. Because sometimes silence is the sound winter makes while deciding whether to spare you. That's a pretty good quote, right? All right, here's another story, The Snow Angel in the Orchard. One last story before we keep going, right? This is a Czech tale. It tells of a grieving father who walked his orchard each night after losing his son in early winter. Snow covered the ground in unbroken white. And one dawn, after a storm, the father found something impossible. It was a single snow angel pressed perfectly onto the surface, child-sized, crisp, and clear. But there were no footprints leading to it. There were no footprints leaving from it. Just the angel itself. And beneath the snow, the barest impression of a smile carved into the shape. Locals say it was the moment the boy's spirit returned not to haunt, but to say goodbye. And even now, orchard workers claim that every few winters, a snow angel appears after a storm, always alone, always perfect, always silent. Not as a threat, as a visitor. And winter in its own solemn way keeps that story alive. So, why are ghost children so persistent in winter folklore? Because winter is both literal and a metaphorical darkness. It represents danger, it demands vigilance, it forces reflection, it slows life down enough for memory to surface, it isolates families in their homes, and in these conditions, every loss is magnified. Every absence feels bigger, every shadow feels more personal, every story feels like it belongs to someone you knew. Ghost children are warnings, but soft ones. They're compassion packaged in fear. Do not wander alone. Do not follow strange lights. Do not leave the path. Do not forget those who didn't return. And folklore is how communities teach survival. And winter, more than any other season, needed those lessons. They were required. Some tribes in the Arctic believe children lost in winter did not die. They just became the snow. White, soft, and endlessly falling, covering the world gently, returning year after year. It's a poetic idea, of course, but it reveals something fundamental. Ghost stories aren't always about fear. They're about continuity. Winter isn't just emptiness. It is memory suspended in cold air. Every flake has a story, every breeze a whisper, every snowstorm a chorus of every voice that winter has ever taken. And in that worldview, children of the snow are everywhere. They're drifting across frozen lakes. They're dancing through pine forests. They're hovering near old barns. They're hiding in the mist. They are not malicious. They are not jealous. They're just there. And a reminder that winter never fully lets go of its stories. So now we're going to approach the emotional heart of these tales. Winter's ghost stories are not like autumn. They are gentler, but they're colder. They're sadder, but quieter. They're lonely, but strangely comforting. They will acknowledge loss, absolutely, but they also acknowledge something deeper. Even in the longest, darkest, coldest nights of winter, we are not alone. There are footsteps behind us. There's breath in the wind. There are lights where no lights should be. And sometimes those lights will guide us home. So now we're approaching the final part of this podcast where we allow these stories to gather meaning. They merge into cultural lessons. And they're going to reveal emotional truth behind these winter hauntings. So there comes a point in every story, every long night, every candlelit vigil, every whispered tale shared close to the fire, when the cold begins to feel like it has a voice of its own. But it's not threatening, and it's not mournful, it's just there. A quiet reminder that the world is vast and dark and old, and that humans wrapped in wool and firelight are very small creatures moving through it. In that kind of silence, the deep winter quiet where sound falls slowly like snowflakes, and even ghosts seem hesitant to disturb the air, we have to learn these lessons. Children of the snow do not scream, they whisper. And they whisper from places where the world is soft and white and unbearably still. So, I'm going to have you imagine this, right? Imagine a frozen lake in northern Scandinavia. It's smooth, it's perfect. The moonlight just rolls across it like silver, like liquid silver, right? In the center of that lake, there are footprints, very tiny ones, and they're just bare feet. No adult footprint leads in, no adult footprint leads out. These are just small patterns curving towards the reeds, and then they end. Locals will say these footprints appear every winter after the first full moon of December. They're always the same size. They're always in the same path. They will call them barnspar, children's tracks. Fishermen will swear they've seen a small figure walking along the ice surface at dusk, although no child is ever missing in the village. Anecdotes like these weren't meant to terrify. They were warnings. You need to respect the ice. You need to respect winter. You need to respect places where children slip silently from the world. Because winter has always taken children. There's accidents, there's illness, there's exposure. Our history is built on heartbreak. Everyone's history is built on heartbreak. And folklore will soften what reality once sharpened to a knife point. Here's another story. This one was told in Swedish logging camps. This is called The Girl with the Blue Mittens. A girl wandered too far into the pines before the first snowstorm. When the men found her mittens lying on the snow, they followed her tracks until they ended in a perfect circle. Now, the loggers say she walks the camp boundaries, leaving blue mittens on fallen trees as a warning when heavy snows are coming. They never found her body, but every year a small pair of blue mittens is discovered on the stump where the men once gathered to warm their hands by the fire. Ghosts, especially child ghosts, often become guardians. It's easier for the living to believe that the lost watch us than to imagine they vanished alone. So, in Eastern European folklore, there's a chilling and beautiful belief that the children who died in winter were taken into the care of the Zimnimaki. That's the winter mother. Snow spirits, gentle, pale, strangely kind. Their stories would change from village to village, but they share one common thread. A child lost in the mountains does not wander alone. They are followed by a presence. They are followed by a hum in the wind, a hand felt near but never seen. Some describe the winter mothers as ghostly women in white fur carrying lanterns made of ice. Some just say they're perfectly shaped drifts, tall, silent, and watching. But their appearance doesn't matter. It's what their function is. Their job is to keep the lost children warm. And in folklore, warmth is not physical. It is a passage. It is guidance. It is the idea that no child crosses into darkness without someone holding their hand. You don't want a child to be alone in this time. So there's these legends that allow this to be the belief. Here's another one. Snow Choir of Moravia. In the hills of old Moravia, farmers told a story of hearing faint singing after heavy storms. Children's voices, soft, distant, in perfect harmony, drifting over the snow, never close, never far, as if the storm itself was singing. One farmer claimed he saw the source, a line of small, luminous silhouettes walking single file into the trees with no footprints behind them. When he called out to them, their singing stopped, as if it was cut with a blade, and silence swallowed the field. He never saw that snow choir again. There's a lot of Victorian influence in stories like this. A blend of religion, melancholy, poetic death, gentle hauntings, sorrow that becomes ritual. That's like a Victorian blueprint, right? So why did winter make ghosts, and why were so many of them children? Victorian Christmas ghost stories did not invent winter spirits. They just rediscovered them. And so long before Dickens, long before E.R. James, long before the British fascination with fireside phantoms, winter was always the season of haunting. And there's 3 reasons. Winter is the season of the highest mortality. The most people died then. Adults died, children died, but they died more. Winter offers a perfect atmospheric canvas. There's fog, there's frost, there's your breath in the air, candlelight, long nights, long memories. Winter is when holidays happen, and that's when families gather. And the people that you don't see that often, they become louder. An empty chair at the Christmas table is a ghost, whether we speak of it or not. So, metaphorically or, literal. Victorian authors did not create ghost children. They simply wrote down what villages had whispered for centuries. Every winter is full of echoes. Ghost stories are how people survived them. Because once a story is told, the ghost belongs to everyone. And shared ghosts are much less frightening than solitary ones. All right, here's another story. This one is called The Boy in the Drifts. This comes from northern Maine. Although, probably much older. It's one of those stories that's probably passed down. A boy was found wandering after a blizzard, barefoot, frostbitten, whispering, "She said not to follow." When he asked who, he pointed towards the forest. Searchers found only a perfectly shaped mound of snow, taller than a human, that looked like it had strands of long white hair frozen into the ice. When the boy eventually recovered, but after every winter after, he left a bowl of warm milk at the tree line. And it wasn't for the woman, it was for the children she gathered. Ghost stories always circle back to the same themes in winter: memory, loss, protection, or transformation. And the children of the snow are not just spirits, they are symbols. They are reminders of the fragility of life in the harshest season. But they are also guides. So now we want to discuss these winter ghosts and why they stick around. They don't do it because they're trapped, but more so the living refuse to let them go. And that's a huge thing to think about. So as the night winds toward dawn, the children of the snow will start to drift back into their white world. Their footsteps will fade. Their whispers dissolve into frost. But winter ghosts do not linger forever. They come when we tell their stories. They rest when we light a candle for them in the cold months. But the snow still remembers. And when the world goes quiet, you may hear those footsteps crossing the drifts behind you. And they're not following, they're just watching. And they're reminding you winter has the memory. And children never truly vanish from a season that carries their name in the wind. So, what do you think about that? Like, there's a lot of information to take in. We've traveled through the snowbound folklore, through drifting silhouettes, through the ancient and universal fear that gave shape to the ghost child tradition. The children of the snow are not horrors. They are echoes. They are warnings. They are guardians. But most of all, they are memory. And winter, more than any other season, remembers what we have lost. So I think that's the point of this is, once again, respect history. Remember, so much of these things we talk about in this podcast is, history based and remembering things from the past. Here's some Ghost, Child, and Winter folklore books that you can check out. I'll post these up in the description for the podcast, in the notes or whatever. There's a couple of books. There's always a Penguin book. Like, Penguin does a really good job of just doing compilations. There's a Penguin book of ghost stories by Michael Newton, who was the editor. It is a collection of Victorian winter tales and multiple child-centric hauntings. There's a book called The Victorian Ghost Stories in Oxford Anthology by Michael Cox and R.A. Gilbert. They were the editors for that. There is a book called The Outcast Spirit, Ghost Children and Folklore by Lieve de Meyer. It's a academic book, but it's not, excuse me, one of those probably boring ones. I mean, some people like academic books. The Ghost of the Frozen North by Christine Daaé. This is a Scandinavian and Arctic winter tradition exploration, including child apparitions. There's a book called The Mysterious North by Pierre Berton. The Dark is Rising by Susan Cooper. Winter Ghost by Kate Mosse. Not the model. It's got an E at the end. The Wild Hunt, Studies in Northern European Mythology by Ronald Hutton. Then you can also go into Shadows in the Snow, Midwinter Hauntings by Alison Grant. And there's just a ghost children's story by Henry James called Turn of the Screw. A lot of people already know that one. There's a book called Ghosts of the Yuletide, Winter Tales of the Supernatural. It is a various authors like mix. And there's a book on the global comparisons of winter wandering spirits, myths of lost children, and liminal weather events by Petra Sundstrom called The Lore of Winter Spirits. So check out one of those books. I'll put the list up. Don't forget, you can help me keep this thing going and just do more research and make these. This is a really long podcast today. And I think I'm going to be able to do a lot longer ones because a lot of people have said they wish the podcast was longer. So we'll see, because this one's pretty long. You can donate to me. There's 2 links on the podcast website. I share it on the social medias every now and then, but the easiest way to find it is on the descriptions for the podcast. You can do it through PayPal, or my hosting company for the podcast has their own built-in. But if you do it through PayPal, the minimum is like $1. So, if you feel the willingness to donate anything, I appreciate it a lot. So, until next time, stay strange, stay curious, stay spooky, and always preserve Halloween.